Hello again, this is Professor Watts, and we're going to talk about Keynesian, monetarist, and Austrian approaches to monetary policy. So, first we'll look at the Keynesian school, and let's have a little background on Keynes, probably the most important person in macro in the last 100 years. So, Keynes really became famous during the Great Depression because he offered a novel and seemingly apt explanation for what was going on in the world economy in the 1930s. But before that, he was a very well established and respected economist in Britain. I want to talk about two important contributions Keynes made in his early years that built his reputation. So first was the book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which came out in 1919. Keynes was a member of the British delegation to the Treaty of Versailles that wrapped up World War I. And Keynes was very critical of the treaty in the way it put very harsh treatment on Germany and forced Germany to pay reparations, which it just couldn't afford because it was bankrupt. And Keynes sensed that the economic oppression of Germany by the Allied powers would lead to economic destabilization and possibly continuation of further conflict down the road, which of course did happen with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s and then World War II. And of course what Germany wound up doing as a consequence of the Versailles Treaty and the absolute draining of its government coffers was resorting to printing money, and that caused hyperinflation, destabilized the economy, and it just led to a terrible outcome. So this was a warning from Keynes against the danger of hyperinflation. But then, several years later, Keynes wrote a book called The Tract on Monetary Reform, where among other things he noted that you could also have deflation, and if the economy went into excessive deflation, that could lead to depression. And he started laying the groundwork for the idea of monetary stimulus to avoid deflation, to keep inflation positive. So by the early 1930s, when Keynes was on the scene addressing the Great Depression, he was really looking like a genius and had a well-earned reputation. Let's just recap a couple key facts about the Great Depression. In Britain, the decline in GDP was actually fairly mild, 5% decline from 29 through 31, but they had already been in depression really through the 1920s. They had a massive decline in their international trade, which is a huge sector of their economy, and they reached 20% peak unemployment rate in 1930. For the US, the 20s had been a great decade of boom and prosperity. They were the roaring 20s in the US. Then we had a massive decline of almost a third in real GDP, 25% peak unemployment in 1933, and then that stayed elevated for all of the 1930s. So some people kind of view the entire decade of the 1930s as the Depression years. And then massive deflation, huge declines in the price level, and we'll talk about this momentarily. This was a deflationary depression, which monetarists and Keynesians too, it's not like they disagree on this, they're going to attribute this to major missteps by monetary authorities. And then a 75% drop in investment spending, just a massive collapse in investment as businesses were facing crushing increases in real debt burdens, massive declines in demand, and it just doesn't make sense to expand in that environment. So businesses really shelve all of their investment and expansion projects. Now, Keynes comes on the scene in the early 1930s and says classical economics can't explain what's going on here. Classical economics associated with real business cycle theory, looking for real shocks. So something going wrong with real factors of production, land, labor, capital, technology. Is there some kind of impairment of those real factors? Is there a reduction in real factors? Well, no, there's no real shocks to explain this. So it has to be something else. And if it's not a real shock, it's not a supply shock, it's a demand shock, it's a spending shock. Furthermore, Keynes and the Keynesians argue that classical economics assumptions don't hold. Prices aren't flexible, markets don't always clear reliably, especially maybe markets for labor, and that's what contributes to the massive unemployment situation. Keynes is going to place emphasis on two big things. One is that total nominal spending, which we today call aggregate demand, is going to be the main driver of short-run fluctuations in the economy. And then uncertainty and fear are really important and hadn't been appreciated enough by economists before this. If the business community, entrepreneurs, become fearful about the future and uncertain about what's going to happen, well then they put investment projects on hold, and they do this kind of as in a herd mentality, and that causes the massive decline in investment. Investment is a driver of growth, and if investment spending collapses, so does the economy. So that brings us to Keynesian business cycle theory, which we can summarize as recessions are caused by negative aggregate demand shocks, something that's causing a massive and sudden drop-off in total spending in the economy. The remedy for this from the Keynesian point of view is going to be fiscal policy. Government spending can engineer a positive aggregate demand shock. And we'll think about this with the expenditures equation for GDP. So Y, real output, consists of consumption spending, investment spending, government purchases, which could be consumption or investment depending on what the government is spending on, and then net exports, which is exports minus imports. Exports, of course, contribute to GDP because they're produced in the country. Imports are spending that does not contribute to GDP, so they have to be netted out. Okay, and then what happens in a demand-driven recession? Well, what we see in the data is a substantial decline in consumption spending, and then an even more substantial decline in investment spending. So if consumption and investment spending are going down, total spending is going down, aggregate demand is falling, and that's leading us into the recession. We'll look at that within the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model here momentarily. And then the policy remedy for the Keynesian is to bring in a spender of last resort, a body that can spend even if it doesn't have any money, right? And we'll mention, where can the government get the money for increased spending? Well, of course, it can print. Ultimately, it can print, or it can increase its debt burden. Okay, so government spending can rise to offset this decline. Government can directly employ some of the resources that are left idle by the decline in consumption and investment spending, and then also restore confidence. And then we could turn this decline in total spending to an increase, which would lead to increased confidence, would lead to a return of investment spending by businesses. That would lead to a rehiring of unemployed workers and a growth of personal income. So that would lead to a growth in consumer spending, at which time, once the confidence is restored, the government could dial back the increase in government spending. So that's the basic Keynesian policy regime in a nutshell. Fiscal stimulus, you offset the decline in consumer spending and business spending, investment, by increasing government spending. And let me just show you straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Keynes, who was, as I mentioned, very well-known economist, probably the most well-known economist in the first half of the 20th century, wrote a public letter, an open letter to Franklin Roosevelt upon Franklin Roosevelt's election to the presidency. Roosevelt was elected, defeated Herbert Hoover in 1932, and then took office in early 1933. And then Keynes had published this letter. I think it was published in the New York Times in the United States, basically giving him some free advice. Right. So here's a little excerpt. Keynes says the object of recovery is to increase the national output and put men to work. In the economic system of the modern world, output is primarily produced for sale, and the volume of output depends on the amount of purchasing power compared with the prime cost of production, which is expected to come on the market. And he goes on, an increase of output cannot occur unless by the operation of one or other of three factors. 1. Individuals must be induced to spend more out of their existing incomes. Okay. What would that be? Well, that would be consumer spending. Try to get consumer spending up again. Now, why did consumer spending decline? It declined because consumers are losing income and they're rationally tightening their spending because they face lower incomes and an uncertain future. So it's probably unlikely that we could just independently get people spending again. All right, so number 2, the business world must be induced either by increased confidence in their prospects or by a lower rate of interest to create additional current incomes in the hands of their employees. So that would be get investment spending up. But again, why did investment spending decline? Because total spending's down, profits are down, business people are rationally deciding to not undertake expansion and investment. So can we talk business people into expanding investment anyway? Probably not. So that brings us to number 3. Public authority must be called in aid to create additional current incomes through the expenditure of borrowed or printed money. So public authority, that of course is government. And this is Keynes saying, look, have the government increase spending. Where is it going to get its money? He's very frank about this. It's going to run up massive deficits or just outright print the money in order to reflate the economy, increase aggregate demand, increase people's confidence, increase people's incomes, and get economic growth back to its potential. And we're now familiar with the ASAD framework, so we can again think about what's going on very simply through the ASAD model. So what's happening in the Keynesian view of recessions, and which looks pretty apt for the 1930s depression? Well, we have a decline in aggregate demand, and because the shortened aggregate supply curve slopes up, which we'll comment on again here momentarily, we're going to see the results of that in the form of a decline in both the inflation rate. So if the decline in aggregate demand is big enough, we go into deflationary territory, and then also a decline in the real growth rate, right? Now, Here I have just a drop from 6% spending growth to -6%. And this could of course take on any combination of values that sum up to the spending growth level. But in this simple example, we have -6% spending growth reflected in -3% deflation, -3% real growth. What's actually happening in the United States in the Great Depression is something more like this: a series of negative aggregate demand shocks that by 1933 have roughly created a spending growth rate of -25%, roughly speaking. And so that translates into a real growth rate of approximately -12%, and then an inflation rate of approximately -13%. So the Keynesian explanation fits very well. It's an apt explanation. And Keynes has tremendous credibility because of this. And many governments across the world are going to start implementing Keynesian policy prescriptions. Roosevelt's New Deal consists of a slew of new government programs that are designed to increase government spending and directly re-employ millions of unemployed men in the U.S. labor force and restore business confidence. So it's a very Keynesian policy prescription that is followed by the United States in the 1930s. Let's take just a minute here to focus on this phenomenon of the upward sloping aggregate supply curve. Why does output respond to total spending changes in the short run? Well, it has to do with a very fundamental empirical truth that not all prices adjust equally to changes in supply and demand. The phenomenon is known as sticky prices and wages. And it's empirically proven. If you examine the trends in price and wage data, you will see that wages in particular are very slow to adjust. We can think about this in terms of a continuum of price flexibility. In other words, how responsive are prices of different goods and products and services to changes in supply and demand? Well, commodities prices are very flexible. They'll change minute by minute. There's active and what we call thick and liquid markets continuously trading commodities, agricultural products, oil and gas, metals, right? So you look at the commodity page of any newspaper and you can see those prices change on a daily basis. If you look online, you can see that they might change on a minute by minute basis. Okay, so commodities prices instantly respond to changes in projected supply and demand. Consumer goods prices maybe don't instantly change, but they'll change as needed. You go into the grocery store, you might notice that the price of apples and oranges is different this week than it was last week. Why? Well, because the weather is changing and that's impacting projections of future crops. Demand for certain consumer products rises based on certain factors, seasonal changes, or based on what's happening in the news. And so you'll see price adjustments for consumer products, not on a daily basis, but maybe over a period of weeks or months, as necessary to adjust the equilibrium to changes in actual supply and demand and keep goods on the shelves and keep consumers happy. Capital goods prices considerably less flexible because they're often set on a yearly rental basis. They're just not repurchased that often. So if you think about businesses renting a building, renting heavy equipment, buying computers, so on and so forth. And then finally at the bottom of the spectrum, with the least flexible being labor, wages and salaries of workers. And they are very sticky because long-term contracting, people's wages are only adjusted typically on a yearly basis, and in some cases it's even more than a 1 year period where people get kind of reassessed and their wages adjusted. And then also highly important is the fact that workers are very resistant to a downward adjustment of their nominal wages. So people resent pay cuts, even if those pay cuts are simply reflecting a decline in the price level. So if there's deflation in the economy and you cut my wages by the amount of deflation, my real wage would stay the same. We can evaluate this with the Fisher equation. I equals R plus pi. Okay? The nominal rate equals the real rate plus inflation. Well, now instead of thinking about the interest rate, we can think about this as the wage, right? We could write it down like this if we liked. W, the nominal wage, equals R, W, the real wage, plus pi. This is describing the rate of growth in the wage. So if my wage is growing at 5% and inflation's 2%, while my real wage is growing by 3%, of course. Right? Now, let's say we move into a deflationary environment. So let's say inflation goes to minus 3%. Okay. Now, to maintain my 3% real wage growth, well, my nominal wage would just not grow at all, right? It would go to a 0% rate of growth. Now, if previously we were in an inflation environment and my wage is growing at 5%, and then we move to a deflation environment and now my wage doesn't grow at all, I don't get my yearly bonus check, for instance.
I can't believe it.
What is it? A letter confirming your reservation at the Nut House?
It's from my company.
Your bonus.
My bonus.
I'm going to be very resentful of that. And that's probably because I'm paying much more attention to my own personal paycheck than I am to the general price level in the economy. This is known as money illusion. Okay. And then furthermore, let's say we go into a steeper deflation environment. So we're at 6% deflation now, and I want to continue receiving maybe 3% wage growth. Well, now my nominal wage would have to fall by 3%. In other words, my boss would say, hey, I'm cutting your wage, but it's okay because we're in a deflationary environment, so your purchasing power is still going to grow. Right? Most people might be scratching their heads. They see the lower number in their paycheck, and they feel upset about that. So very difficult for firms to cut wages in a nominal sense. As I like to describe this, labor is the only factor of production that has feelings, and when its price changes, it triggers feelings and an emotional response, and so businesses are very reluctant to cut people's wages. This has been empirically demonstrated very well. The masterpiece in this literature is by economist Truman Bewley, Why Wages Don't Fall During a Recession. There's Bewley, and I'll just summarize a very wonderful book that's based on interview data. So Bewley went and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of managers and HR personnel at companies and said, well, what do you do when you need to adjust the wage bill down? Right? For example, when a recession hits, you need to cut costs. Wages are going to be a tremendous cost center for most businesses. And here's what Bewley found. Companies don't cut individual workers' wages. What they do is cut the wage bill just by doing massive layoffs, by shedding workers, and then often with the remaining workers, they'll give them nominal pay increases to keep them happy and motivated. Right? So to summarize, Bewley finds that wage cuts hurt worker morale more than they would help profitability. So businesses very rarely do outright wage cuts, meaning that the price of labor is very sticky. And here's some further empirics on that. Employment cost index for wages and salaries. You can see it never goes down. Here I'm going back to about the year 2000, and there's two episodes of recession here. 2001, a pretty brief mild recession, and then 2008, 2009, a pretty severe recession. These things don't go down. The rate of growth might taper off a little bit, but that's almost not noticeable. Okay? So you might expect the employment cost to decline during a recession when unemployment is spiking. Here we had unemployment at 10%, so there's a lot of, quote, surplus workers who might be willing to re-enter jobs at reduced wages, but no, they don't. Wages stay high, unemployment stays high, wage growth doesn't decline, and so we have this phenomenon of sticky wages contributing to the severity of recessions. On the other hand, here's crude oil, up and down all over the place. It adjusts massively in a downward direction in the face of declining demand in the recession. Okay, and you can see it's very volatile. It adjusts kind of on a daily basis given changes in prospective supply and demand. So sticky wages versus flexible prices. Okay, now, so jumping back to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, we can apply the Keynesian concept here. If we have a decline in aggregate demand causing a recession, the remedy is to have government policy increase government spending to offset the decline in consumption and investment spending, to restore aggregate demand to its previous level, restore business confidence, consumer confidence, and return the economy back to this initial equilibrium. Okay, we had to fall into this equilibrium here through the negative aggregate demand shock. We want to push it back to there. Here's a table summarizing some sources of positive and negative demand shocks. Slower money growth. Okay, so it could be the responsibility of your monetary authority to make sure money growth doesn't decline too much. Fear, that would be a huge point of emphasis for the Keynesians. Fear, and what Keynes said, the animal spirits of the business community. And those can be positive or negative, and they can kind of change on a dime. We talked about wealth effects in the lecture about the channels of monetary policy. Taxes would be another thing Keynesians emphasized. You can increase consumer spending by reducing people's taxes. Okay, and then there's government spending. Okay, so these are the more Keynesian points of emphasis. The monetarist, which we'll talk about momentarily, will focus almost exclusively on this issue of money growth. Okay, one final point about the Keynesian way of thinking about recession is the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve represents the idea that there's a trade-off between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And this certainly looked true in the Great Depression. What happens in the Great Depression? Inflation gets really low, in fact negative, deflation, and unemployment rises. So the idea is that as the inflation rate goes down, the unemployment rate goes up. So in a Great Depression situation, you're moving down to the right on the Phillips curve. You have very high unemployment and very low inflation. The remedy to that is to increase spending, which of course is going to lead to higher inflation, but that's going to boost economic growth for reasons of the sticky wages phenomenon and short and aggregate supply curve, which we just discussed. So if you can get the inflation rate up, you can get the unemployment rate back down. We'd be, in that case, moving up and to the left on the Phillips curve. Okay, so this idea that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and it's up to government policy-making authorities, whether monetary or fiscal, to find the sweet spot here, right? We want to keep unemployment low, but we realize that to push unemployment down too much might require excessive inflation. So where's the sweet spot? Well, maybe somewhere in here. Unemployment's at 4 or 5%, inflation's at 4 or 5%. Okay, this is just a suggestive framework here. This is an actual fit to the historical data, although Phillips, the economist for whom this is named, did fit historical data and found some pretty consistent relationships for certain historical time periods. Okay, so the Phillips curve is another way to think about the Keynesian approach to macroeconomic stabilization policy. Okay, let's turn to monetarism now. As the term implies, monetarists think the money supply, monetary factors, are the most important thing with respect to macro fluctuations. Okay, and here's our old pal Milton Friedman. There's the equation of exchange. All right, so money is the most important thing. And when we think about money times velocity, what do we call that? Well, we call that aggregate demand. Money and velocity, with the emphasis on money, aggregate demand, or total nominal spending, being the most important thing in the economy. Well, that sounds like the Keynesians, doesn't it? Yes, but monetarists are going to give much more weight to the money supply itself. What does that mean? Keynesians are thinking about total spending. Keynesians are thinking about the issues of fear, uncertainty, animal spirits, and so on. So it can be summarized in this way. Monetarists place emphasis on the M of the total spending, whereas Keynesians place emphasis on the V, velocity. Okay? So what matters more, how much money is put into the economy or how willing people are to spend it? Now, monetarism also has a pretty apt explanation for the Great Depression, and that is this. You have roughly a 1/3 drop in the money supply in the US in the early 1930s, and that corresponds to a roughly 1/3 drop in real GDP. And this case was laid out definitively by Milton Friedman and his research colleague Anna Schwartz in a very well-respected book known as The Great Contraction. So the Great Contraction, that's the 1/3 drop in money, and that's, according to Friedman and Schwartz and the monetarist way of thinking, the prime causal factor of the terrible economic depression of the 1930s. And whose fault is it? Well, that would be the Fed's fault, because the Fed by 1929, 1930 is responsible for the money supply in the US and for ensuring elasticity and growth of the money supply. The Fed should have cut the discount rate, supplying liquidity to banks, doing its lender of last resort function. It didn't. It actually raised its lending rate to banks and supplied very minimal credit and loans of reserves to banks that were in trouble all across the country in several rounds of financial crises and monetary contraction in the early 1930s. The US was actually, we were still on the gold standard at this time. We were experiencing large gold inflows in the early 1930s. Much of that was from Europe, which is starting to kind of feel the storm winds of war and militarism growing again. So there was a lot of capital flight towards the US. The US monetary base was growing, but the Fed sterilized it by refusing to expand reserves and lending to member banks, which contributed to the deflation we experienced. Should have probably had some mild inflation in the early 1930s because of that influx of gold, because of that natural growth of the monetary base. But instead, we had pretty severe deflation. And the monetarists would say, well, the Fed should have been looking at the monetary aggregates. Now, granted, there might not have been very good data at the time, but you could definitely size up at least the monetary base, the amount of gold sitting in banks' vaults. And if that's growing, arguably the overall money supply ought to be growing. Well, maybe the Fed was too concerned about inflation. But if you're too concerned about inflation, you have to watch out that you don't let the economy slide into harmful deflation. Okay, so the monetarists say, yep, it's the Fed that screwed up and caused the Great Depression because they were insufficiently monetarist, right? And then, again, in the 1970s with the Great Inflation. Let's walk through that historical episode. In the 1970s, we had two major real shocks, in the 1970s, we had a series of two major negative real shocks or negative supply shocks in the forms of the oil crisis. So there was the oil embargo from the OPEC nations that hit in late 1973, caused a massive increase in oil prices through 1974, uptick in inflation, crimped profits for many industries. Energy and oil is really central in the cost structure of almost all businesses. So we had a supply side recession in 1974. And then in 1979, there was the Iranian crisis and another sharp increase in the oil price with similar effects. So you could pinpoint some negative supply shocks which are going to trigger recessions a la the real business cycle model. The Fed mistakenly engages in aggregate demand stimulus to try to help the economy recover from those recessions. Here's Arthur Burns, who was at the helm of the Federal Reserve during this time period. Negative supply shocks should bring higher inflation, and they do, and I call that the sad but true inflation. We don't want to avoid that kind of inflation because that's reflecting the reality of higher resource costs. Positive aggregate demand shocks, which is what Federal Reserve stimulus creates, are just going to lead to additional inflation without additional real growth. Why? Because the Fed can't shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. All it can do is shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So this is what I refer to as needless inflation that we tack on top of the already increasing inflation rate due to the negative real shocks. Higher inflation rates engendered by both the negative real shocks and then the Fed's overreaction lead to higher inflation expectations, which show up in an upward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. And therefore, we wind up at the end of the 1970s with stagflation, both high inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth or recession. As the Fed attempts to continually return the economy to growth through increasing aggregate demand, increasing the money supply too much, we find that unemployment doesn't respond anymore. What's happening here? Well, in a higher inflation environment, workers start to demand higher and higher wage increases. And so it's discovered that you can't simply cure unemployment by increasing the inflation rate in the long run. The Phillips curve is vertical. In other words, in the long run, that seemingly available trade-off between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate breaks down. And so you can have high unemployment, stubbornly high unemployment with a rising inflation rate. And that's the environment the United States economy is in at the end of the 1970s, stagflation, with increasing and fairly oppressively high inflation rates. In fact, inflation rates that the United States economy had really never seen before outside of the wartime emergencies where the government just outright printed money to finance a war effort, such as Civil War or to some extent during the World Wars. So now we have an inflation problem, and to cure the inflation crisis of the late 1970s, the Fed is going to have to raise real interest rates to squash the growth of money and spending. To cure inflation, you have to bring money growth down, right? That's what monetarism teaches us. MV equals PY. If you have excessive inflation here, it's caused by excessive money growth, right? And what we have to do is bring money growth down to a much lower level so we can bring the inflation down. But because of the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply phenomenon and sticky wages, you can't have a reduction in the growth of total spending without some reduction, at least in the short run, of real output. So you bring inflation down, you bring real output down in the short run. This is an intentional recession that the Fed causes in order to tame the inflationary beast. So President Carter is going to put an inflation fighter, economist Paul Volcker, in charge of the Fed in 1979, when the inflation problem has become the main problem in the United States. Volcker's going to initiate a tight money policy focused on reducing the rate of money growth, a very monetarist themed policy. And that is going to cause short-term interest rates to spike. They reach almost 20% in 1980, 81, 82, as the Fed indicates that it's serious about reducing the inflation rate. So this leads to a sharp recession, actually a double dip recession. 1980, there's brief recovery, but then there's another round of recession in 82. But the fact that the Fed is willing to endure these recessions and instead of trying to reverse course and stimulate the economy again as they had done in the 1970s recessions, convinces the public that the Fed is serious about this. They're going to bring inflation down. And once inflation falls, through the Fisher equation, we know that the interest rate can fall. And if inflation falls substantially, the real interest rate can go down along with the nominal interest rate. And then credit is now available again for business expansion to renew. So then after about 1982, inflation is down to about 3 or 4%, which is manageable. It had been as high as 14% in 1980, and that restores confidence in the business and consumer world in the US and sets the stage for renewed growth. You're going to get some additional supply side factors with tax cuts that arguably contribute to renewed growth in the 1980s. Okay, so let's wrap up for now with a brief foray into the Austrian school. I'd like to give a little background on the Austrian school because it's something completely new for us.
And now for something completely different.
It starts in Vienna with the economist Karl Menger, who was part of the marginal revolution in economics about the year 1871. So here's Menger, his most famous work, which is titled Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre, translated into English as Principles of Economics. And it's in this book where he lays out the idea of the marginal theory of value. Now, what is the marginal theory of value? Are you familiar with it? If not by name, you definitely are, because this is translated into the supply and demand framework. The demand curve is really just the marginal value curve for whatever product or resource we are analyzing. The supply curve is just the marginal cost curve for whatever product we're analyzing. So marginal analysis is reflected fully in the supply and demand framework, and then price formation, of course, is subject to changing marginal costs or marginal valuations of goods by consumers and producers. So marginal value, supply and demand, very fundamental. So the Austrian school continues with Baumbacherk and von Mises, who were some of the students of Karl Menger in Vienna, and they made important contributions respectively to capital theory and then monetary economics. Now von Mises was a towering thinker in economics, and he made many contributions across the field, but in his early years he was a monetary economist above all. So developing theories of capital and how the economy works and how money plays into investing decisions, how interest rates work, and how the market process is coordinated by changes in interest rates to coordinate people's decisions about consuming and investing, is what this line of thinking is all about. And this is going to be further developed by Mises and his brilliant pupil Friedrich Hayek, who was also originally from Vienna. So the Viennese roots of all these thinkers is where we get the name the Austrian school. Now there's still people who carry on in this way of thinking and this way of modeling the economy, mostly in the United States, but it's still referred to as the Austrian school due to its historical roots. Mises actually fled Vienna, I think in 1940, being ethnically Jewish. He was subject to Nazi persecution. He was able to escape to New York, and he spent the rest of his career in the United States. Hayek was able to come to the United States initially in the 1920s, and he did economic research and studied the U.S. economy then. And then he spent the bulk of his academic career in Great Britain. He was actually closely acquainted with John Maynard Keynes. And then Hayek spent the final decades of his career back in the United States as well. So Mises and then Hayek developed a monetary theory of business cycles, which we now refer to as the Austrian business cycle theory. And Hayek first started working out this way of thinking in the mid 1930s. He was contemporaneous with Keynes. Now, I'm not going to give a complete lecture here on the Austrian business cycle theory, A, because it would take too long, and B, because it's been done so well and so much better than I could by Professor Roger Garrison, formerly of Auburn University. And I will refer to you to this 45-minute lecture video where he spells out the entire Austrian business cycle theory with reference to its peak development by Friedrich Hayek, including a very nice and I think very easy to understand graphical model of how the Austrian theory operates. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that, and then what I'll do right now is just kind of summarize how this plays out. So the Austrian theory is a boom-bust story, emphasis on the boom, which we find lacking in the monetarist or Keynesian stories. But the Austrians have a very rich way of thinking about excessive growth in the economy. It starts with credit overexpansion by a central bank. Interest rates set below the market equilibrium in order to stimulate economic growth. And we're very familiar with this. We know that the Fed in particular has been pursuing an interest rate targeting policy for many decades. Well, the problem with this is that if you set interest rates too low for too long, you cause excessive money growth. Okay, monetarists would say, that's going to create inflation. And yes, very true. Austrians are going to say, in addition to that, you're going to change the structure of investment and capital in the economy in ways that are unsustainable and perhaps very damaging. And of course, we know that in the short run, if inflation starts off at a low rate, in the short run, credit expansion can reduce the nominal interest rate. Inflation's still low because inflation reacts with a lag. We can see a reduction in the real interest rate, and businesses might expand investment due to a reduction in the real interest rate. Cheap credit leads to more business investment, specifically in early stage capital, which is long-term projects with distant payoffs. Cheap credit entices consumers, on the other hand, to purchase more durable goods that are usually financed by debt, cars, houses, for example, leading to more investment in late stage capital, which would be capital investments that are created to help businesses meet higher consumer demand. So an example of that late stage capital would be construction companies trying to build more houses. So they're buying more tools in lumber and things like that. Car companies are ramping up production at the factories because there's more demand for completed cars. An example of the early stage capital that's also stimulated would be things like mining and research and development. To open a new mine might take years before it's surveyed and then dug and then goes into production, feeding ore into a production process that's ultimately going to create new cars, for instance. So a car company could ramp up production of assembled cars, in a very short-term time period. Hire some more workers, add shifts. They could do that in a matter of months, probably. Whereas opening a new mine, early stage capital, probably takes years until it joins the supply chain and starts paying off. So there's this distinction between early and late stage capital is very important in the Austrian theory. Now, the point that Hayek and the Austrians are going to emphasize is that credit over expansion, by reducing interest rates and causing the value of long-term projects to increase, but also spurring additional consumer demand, is going to cause an unsustainable attempt to increase investment at both ends of the capital structure, both the early and the late stage projects. Okay, so that means two things. One is that we're going to have overinvestment. There's just not enough savings available to finance all of the attempted increase in investment in the economy. And then we have the prospect of malinvestment, investments that are bad kind of from the get-go, although it's not known because interest rate signals have been clouded, because we're trying to add more early stage projects that have a long-term payoff. Investable resources are going to be poured into creating more early stage projects that it's going to be realized eventually weren't justified because the reduction in interest rates that made their long-term capital values grow were ephemeral. They were kind of false signals. Interest rates really didn't go down. They just appeared to go down due to an attempt at economic stimulus by the central bank. Okay, what comes next then? Of course, as monetarism would tell us, inflation, and that's true, but we want to have a little bit more nuanced thinking about this. You have increases in consumer spending because cheap credit is leading to more attempts to finance durable goods purchases, and then business investment spending. That means total spending is going to grow, and the growth rate accelerates. And you'll recall from the equation of exchange that real growth can only increase so much. So we'll think about MV growth equals inflation plus real growth. And we might have started right here. 6% spending growth breaks down to 3% inflation, 3% real growth. Well, what if we ramp up MV growth to, let's say, 10%? Maybe in the short run we can boost real growth a little bit by overtaxing our real resources. But there's a limit to that, and that means the inflation rate has to pick up the rest of the slack. So now we've got a massive increase in inflation and a pretty minimal and short-term increase in real growth. And this is going to set the stage for an economic correction. Higher inflation rates mean we're going to have growth in nominal and real interest rates per the Fisher equation. And in fact, if this is the arithmetic we're looking at, right, we'd have to have a 3 percentage point increase in the nominal interest rate just to keep real interest rates stable. Now initially, because this increased inflation is unanticipated, real interest rates are going to go down, and then real interest rates have to get adjusted upward. And then depending on people's expectations of what's going to happen to the inflation rate in the future, the real rate could go up even more if there's an over adjustment, an over correction, so to speak. If you have an inflation targeting central bank, you're going to have a tightening of monetary policy because the central bank says, oh darn, we got inflation too high and now we need to tamp that back down, and the only tool they have to do that is to cut the rate of money supply growth. And that's going to lead to potential further increases in the interest rate because the central bank, such as the Fed, is going to use interest rate targeting to achieve its inflation target goal. So basically what happens here is you have to have an unwinding of the initial policy. If the initial policy was stimulative, unwinding that is going to be contractionary. And this can happen pretty swiftly. It can lead to a crash, it can lead to a dramatic crash, or it could lead to a drawn out crash, or both. Higher real interest rates are going to reduce asset values. This is the Bocephus principle at work.
The interest is up and the stock market's down, and you're only getting mugged if you go downtown.
And lower asset values mean a decline in firms' net worth and in their balance sheets, and if that is a significant enough decline, it could lead firms to bankruptcy, and then firms in bankruptcy have to liquidate a lot of their assets. A lot of these assets, due to the initial stimulus with the low interest rates, are, again, new investments in long-term capital projects that have now lost a substantial amount of value based on the increase in interest rates, and then, as a follow-on effect, based on the decline in spending and then the recessionary environment that follows from that. Furthermore, inflation would lead to a reduction in real wages, which would reduce real consumer spending, potentially causing consumer bankruptcies in cases where consumers took on excessive debt. So this is just a quick overview, and you'll notice that even my quick overview, it's a pretty complicated theory. It's trying to encompass a lot of moving parts in the economy, a lot of decision making. And in the Austrian way of thinking about economics in general, it's important to note that prices are viewed as signals that help coordinate the actions of consumers and producers and kind of keep the economy functioning smoothly at a macro level. Now, at a micro level, people gain and lose jobs, businesses gain and lose profitability. There's lots of startup businesses, there's lots of failing businesses, but overall a price mechanism will keep an economy in a growth pattern because it tells entrepreneurs, here's what works, here's what's profitable, here's what doesn't work, here's what's not profitable. It tells consumers, here's consumption that you can afford, that you can't afford. And in a general sense, what central bank stimulus policy through manipulating interest rates, through cutting interest rates does is basically just throws a wrench into the works of that signaling mechanism. It gives people a false signal. It tells entrepreneurs, hey, there's more investment opportunities that you should be undertaking. There's more credit available in the economy than there really is. It tells consumers, you can go ahead and sustainably increase your consumption, whether that's buying more house, taking on a bigger mortgage, having a bigger car payment, having more credit card debt, etc. So it's a nuanced and complicated story in the details, and when you get into the model, with Professor Garrison, you'll see that he lays that out pretty neatly in a graphical sense that simplifies it enough to where you can comprehend it, but still includes all these different dynamic elements. But at the higher level, it's a story of basically a central governmental authority screwing with price signals that are essential for overall economic coordination and causing a discoordination, which leads to a boom-bust cycle. Many economists saw Austrian business cycle theory playing out in the housing boom and bust, which ended with the financial crisis and then recession of 2008-2009. And I'll close with a prominent example of that application. Stanford University's John Taylor, the Taylor rule guy, who thought the Austrian theory applied. He might not have called it the Austrian business cycle theory by name, but the story he told conforms very well with the Austrian business cycle way of thinking. And here's just a brief snippet of what he had to say about this. He's kind of doing a post-mortem on the financial crisis, and then the recession would have been kind of at its depth at this time here in 2009. He says, monetary excesses were the main cause of the boom. The Fed held its target interest rate, especially through 2003 through 2005, well below known monetary guidelines that say what good policy should be based on historical experience. By the way, that's based on the Taylor rule. Keeping interest rates on the track that would worked well in the past 2 decades rather than keeping rates so low would have prevented the boom and bust. So there was confounding issues, and Taylor says the effects of the boom and bust were amplified by several complicating factors, including the use of subprime and adjustable rate mortgages, which led to excessive risk taking. And then other government actions were at play. The government-sponsored enterprises Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were encouraged to expand and buy mortgage-backed securities, including those formed with the risky subprime mortgages. And he wraps up by saying it did not have to be this way. To prevent misguided actions in the future, it is urgent that we return to sound principles of monetary policy, basing government interventions on clearly stated diagnoses and predictable frameworks for government actions. What lessons can we draw from all these situations? Well, the 1930s teaches us that the central bank, the monetary authority, should avoid monetary contraction at all costs. It leads to deflationary depression. And the lender of last resort should do its job. It should lend in a crisis. Fed failed on both counts. We got the biggest depression so far in U.S. history. In the 1970s, we saw that aggregate demand stimulus is not effective against negative supply shocks, and that you can't permanently exploit the inflation-unemployment trade-off as suggested by the kind of naive version of the Phillips curve. If you get into an excessive inflation environment, the only cure for that is tight money, and that's going to involve a recession. So maybe you don't want to get into excessive inflation to begin with, and that is an encouragement to inflation targeting, which is indeed going to be adopted, starting in the 1980s. Thousands, a housing boom and bust, suggests that monetary stimulus through continual low interest rate policy can lead to asset bubbles, malinvestment, and unsustainable excessive growth. And then the Fed's actions in particular of inconsistent and ad hoc lender of last resort policies and bailouts only serve to exacerbate a financial crisis. I'll conclude with this thought. Are we better off Fedless without the Fed? Well, some economists think so. There's been publications, including in mainstream journals, such as the Journal of Macroeconomics, that suggests the Fed has been a failure in terms of just achieving some basic macroeconomic goals: stable inflation, interest rates, and unemployment, the Fed's own dual mandate rubric. And this article in particular suggests that if you take the entire track record of the Fed over its first 100 years, it didn't lead to greater stability in inflation and unemployment and economic growth than the really chaotic and poorly regulated pre-Fed system did. And people who think we might be better off without a Fed would suggest that you can have market forces determine interest rates. You should have inflation rates fluctuate up and down to reveal the impact of positive and negative supply side factors. So in the 1970s, we should have had some increase in inflation due to the oil crises, but not the inflation we did have because that was exacerbated by the Fed's misguided actions. What about lender of last resort? Could you do that without a Fed? Well, sure, you could have bank-led clearinghouses do lender of last resort functions, as they did in the pre-Fed era, although it was very constricted due to some legal restrictions. So, maybe if we just remove legal restrictions, market entities like interbank clearinghouses could handle lender of last resort functions, and arguably in a more capable way than a government institution, the Fed. If you need to keep the Fed around, its role could be reduced to establishing stable growth in the monetary base and then letting free banking systems control the supply of currency and credit themselves, and that would be regulated through strictly market mechanisms. Now, I'm not particularly advocating any of these policies. I just want to raise the questions. I think it's incumbent on us as monetary economists to not fall into a false status quo that suggests, Bill, because we have the Fed, we should just put up with the Fed. Well, we should think about alternatives. Maybe the Fed is the best alternative. Maybe the Fed can learn. Maybe the Fed can improve. But let's think about, as we like to say in economics, compared to what? There's other ways of handling monetary policy, and you as a student should at least be familiar with those.